So in this video, I want to continue the series that I started before, talking about racial capitalism and space privatization. I think that this is a really interesting resolution because it kind of starts from the position that private space exploration is unjust, but a lot of the argumentation that will end up being made on this resolution will have to do about why why that preserves various forms of public space exploration and why that is kind of necessary. And so I think that there are a lot of really interesting ways in which racial capitalism kind of colludes or intersects with the idea of what kind of space exploration looks like, in the way in which space exploration as a statement on our relationship to humanity and upward mobility kind of invests in various types of values that only create forms of the same type of symbolic investments that have been forwarded since the Cold War in order to show white mobility and various forms of kind of capital gain as modes of what human freedom look like. And I think that being able to critique this as a way that teams are thinking about the role of international politics and the role that kind of the modeling of what we ban in terms of space colonization looks like are really interesting places for you to talk about what role that kind of urban mobility, ghettoization, privatization, etc. kind of serve in the context of what human spaceflight looks like. And so I think that being able to kind of discuss this in terms of this resolution on the negative is super important, and really where I want to start this video. I want to talk about what racial capitalism, what the kind of strengths of it are, and what I think are the places where you should kind of be focusing the most, and then what I'm kind of thinking about on the framing and thesis kind of terms of the debate to give you a good idea of what you should be doing at a top level idea, so that you can have a good frame for a lot of the other stuff that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of the series as we kind of get back to doing a more normalized series to a lot of the stuff that I've been doing before. I think that when I'm just kind of considering what are the strengths of reading this type of argument on the negative, is that I think that it allows you to deal with the part of the resolution that is kind of supposed to be the negative state action portion of the resolution a lot easier. I feel a lot of teams will try to get away with being the rejection of privatized space, or of private entities from getting into space is much worse than public exploration of space. I feel a lot of our teams will kind of start from the argumentation that the kind of privatization of space is one that's infinitely more ethical, and that space exploration is inevitable. And so it's just a question of what ways are we able to create kind of rules and procedures around the way in which that space exploration is done. And I think that being able to refute that claim from a top level is really necessary regardless of the critique you read. And racial capitalism is really good at being able to do that, because it's really good at connecting the ways in which space privatization only exists in a world of the kind of national memory and national values that have been pushed since the Cold War about what a white American freedom looks like in the context of how liberalism can be pursued outside of just the home base, or home itself. And I think there are so many arguments to be made about how the kind of extraction efforts that are being made from these private entities that people will cite in the context of SpaceX and other privatized corporations kind of originate from the way in which the state kind of produced ghettoization and various forms of debt in order to produce the necessary financial status in order to create the means for its own type of space exploration. And so making an argument about those are kind of one and the same in terms of their ethical means is really helpful in terms of being able to build really strong link arguments about what the problem of white space exploration as a whole is, and being able to win that kind of investment, and being able to accomplish that through through the system that exists now continues to require the sacrificial logic of leaving some here in order for us to explore out there and create new scenes of colonialism where resource extraction can be repeated in ways that are much more harmful. I feel what this means is that when you're thinking about the type of arguments you want to make at a framing level, a lot of the arguments that I feel are the best ones to make are ones about why it's not a question that you should be able to think about the question of whether or not space exploration is able to provide the necessary justifications for further forms of colonialism, or the reenacting of colonialism in various other spaces. I think that a lot of the arguments that you really want to be made are what is the kind of key difference between privatization and public financialization of space, and how does it produce the same means of violence. In ways I think that you can kind of make that part of the way in which the judges kind of viewing the debate is by changing the calculus to whether or not we're able to save ourselves, or be able to create a world where we're fighting against the idea of trying to mitigate things like space debris and these other kind of neutral risk factors towards humanity, and being able to see them as things that can only be kind of exercised through their kind of history that's already entrenched in racial capitalism. I feel a lot of the crises that people kind of start to talk themselves through in terms of what space exploration really does are these crises that are already built out of human activity that's being done in the context of space, and that ultimately kind of like uses these like neutral threats as a way to pursue the vitality of like humanity as a whole in general, and being able to win that in and of itself is an act of like kind of like white imaginary, and the way in which people are able to justify why like the space exploration project as a whole would be good for the American citizen, and even though it kind of like produces its own ghettoization, is a really important part for you to kind of like tie the history of like racial capitalism and its relationship to this particular type of resolution to the type of logic that is being forwarded in debate by these exact affirmatives, so that you can win that kind of like basis for how we think about like the connection of like what types of threats the judge should be evaluating already is kind of invested in the same type of imagery that you're like kind of critiquing, and thus requires a differential view to what we think about violence, and also why like a differential view of like how we think about space could be used in order to resolve a lot of these kind of like neutral kind of like extremist disasters that people are kind of citing in terms of like what is kind of like endangering humanity, etc. I then think that when you get to a thesis level, a lot of the questions that I feel like you need to really tie like why the affirmative should be rejected to are not on the basis of whether or not it's just like a question of like whether or not they're connected to privatization, but rather like what are we willing to sacrifice in order to make space exploration possible, and how does the getting rid of space privatization only legitimize and make ethical this kind of like idea of equal public that is equally invested in space operations as a whole. I feel like a lot of the affirmatives will kind of win that a united front in towards space is much better than one split one that like allows like privatization and capital gain to take over, but I feel like your argument needs to be that this idea of a united public is one that only exists out of a white American liberal dream that's born in the Civil War to protect like a core community within American domestic territory by forwarding a way of thinking about space exploration that like sutures it as something that is natural, inevitable, in order to make it seem more ethical than the alternatives that happen in the world of privatization, but ultimately allow for like the ethical reinvestment into sources of like ghettoization, into ways of extraction and forms of creating like resource extraction and like financial extraction that only make it like harder to think about like what mobility looks like at a domestic level as it kind of transitions into like recreating those same types of inequalities via space exploration. And so it's not just a question of whether or not the values of like racial capitalism get exported into like whatever world that's explored next, but rather how space exploration as an ethos creates the justification for those forms of extraction to continue as like the functions of racial capitalism on the ground today as that exploration is done above, which then increases the kind of like sacrificial logic of like how that system is able to continue itself, and I think opens up a really interesting place for you to build out some of the more specific portions of the criticism that we'll be talking about in the next video. Thank you as much as always for watching, and yeah, thanks for tuning in.